Film Bros, assemble once again! Hey guys, welcome back to Horsetooth Cinema, and today I am doing another one of my director ranking videos, where I go through a director's entire filmography and rank their films from worst to best. And today the guy we're tackling is another big film bro director, of course, and that's Christopher Nolan. I figured it'd be a good time to do this now that Oppenheimer has come out. I've seen it, most people have seen it, so it feels like a good time to talk about kind of Nolan's larger body of work. And I know I joke a lot about Nolan and Tarantino and some other directors of, as being film bro directors, but the truth is I like Nolan a lot. Up until recently, I'm not sure if I would have called him like one of my favorite filmmakers or even one of my favorite filmmakers working today, just because there's a certain section of his career where I find that he does a lot of like indulgences in his style that I do find kind of inhibit the work for me personally. And I'll definitely get into that, but I think there's also a huge section of his work that I just kind of unabashedly really adore. And there's even a couple of films in his filmography that I would say I do love, and they are some of my favorite films of all time. So yeah, I'm just going to jump right into it, and I will mention, of course, that I'm only doing feature-length films, so I'm not going to be counting like Doodlebug or Tarantella, stuff like that. Alright, so number 12, my least favorite Christopher Nolan film is Following. I suppose it's a bit of a compliment to Christopher Nolan that I'm putting his very first film last on this list, meaning that he only got better from here. I don't really like Following very much, but I do think that it's pretty impressive for the budget. $6,000 for a film that was shot over weekends. It does come together at least decently cohesively for an independent film. And it also captures a really nice 16mm look with the photography that I'm always going to be a fan of. I think I've joked on my channel that if a film is shot on 16mm, it can't be a 1-star movie. It's got to be a 2-star at the very least. So I think more than anything, what you get out of Following is you get to see Christopher Nolan's like keen interest in kind of noir characters. Here it's kind of set on this lead character who has very voyeuristic tendencies, which is, right out of something like Rear Window. And I do wish that Following had either, a really elegant, Hitchcockian kind of craft that you get out of those kind of noir thrillers, or if it kind of went into the sleazier elements of these kind of voyeuristic characters like Brian De Palma did a lot in his career. So this is a feature that, while it's very compact, it does lack personality and intrigue for me. But again, it is pretty impressive for the budget. I just can't really imagine people getting that much out of this outside of like Nolan completionism. My number 11 on the list is The Dark Knight Rises. This is the last film on the list I would call bad, and it's really the only film he's made that had a real budget, more than $6,000, that I've had a strong disliking towards. If you've seen my Batman ranked video, you know the iterations of the character and of kind of the world of Gotham that I prefer, and it is far away from the world of this movie. The best Batman adaptations, I think, really go for this like gritty neo-noir squalid Gotham that I really don't think Nolan is that interested here. He goes for a much cleaner, metallic look to the city, but that really just kind of strips away all of the aesthetic and charm for me. I mean, Gotham in this movie could practically just be New York City. This also might be my least favorite score of Hans Zimmer's. I find that this is just really lacking in composition, and it's just kind of hitting you over the head with the same things over and over again, even for him. A lot of people complain about Bane in this movie, mainly because of the mask on his face and the fact that you can't really hear a single word that he says throughout some of the runtime. And that honestly doesn't bother me that much. I actually can hear him at least decently sometimes. They did fix it, much better after the initial trailer came out. But I do struggle with the villain still. I think that compared to the psychological power that Heath Ledger's Joker holds over Bruce, in the previous film, I think this one's a very clear step down. He just felt kind of like your stock, like brunt force villain. Not nearly as interesting as something like Heath Ledger's Joker or Harvey Dent's Two-Face. And I really wish that The Dark Knight could have carried over the Two-Face character into this film. I think it would have been a much more kind of cohesive arc in the trilogy. Those are relatively minor complaints, considering that, this is still a Nolan action movie. It's got a really big budget, and his craft, comes through in that budget. But what I really don't like this film is the ending. I think it is just a complete cop-out. I've heard people talk about how you can read the ending kind of ambiguously, but I just really don't agree. I think the ending kind of robs Bruce of his real arc for the entire trilogy, and it really kind of loses the emotional impact that it would have had on the audience. My number 10 is, big shocker here, Inception. I know it's definitely a hot take to put Inception this low on the list. Some people kind of herald it as Nolan's masterpiece. I've just always felt so alienated by it. While it's a lot more cohesive than the previous two films that I've talked about, it is maybe the film where I most struggle with Nolan's dialogue. It's so dry, expository, and functional that I really just kind of start to lose interest in the scenes. And for how confusing some people claim that this is, I actually find that it tends to over-explain itself, especially in this dialogue, in a very, pretentious way. The biggest issue, though, for me, similarly to The Dark Knight Rises, is that Nolan's, cold, stripped-down, metallic aesthetic doesn't really fit a story like this for me. Ultimately, this is a film about dreams, and it portrays these dreams as very ultra-literal experiences. I find that the film is very trapped in the way that the real world looks, and it doesn't really add much imagination to the way that dreams really take place. I look at a film, for example, like Satoshi Kon's Paprika, which is a film that I think Nolan has said he drew inspiration from for Inception. And that film is so psychedelic, so abstract, so dreamlike in its imagery that I really do feel like I'm dreaming when I watch it, or at the very least I completely buy that the characters are dreaming. You could also look at David Lynch movies. I mean, those are always so abstract, almost to the point of being anti-logical, but it really works for capturing kind of the paranoid experiences of really terrifying dreams. And I just don't think that Inception has anything close to that, even though it's not necessarily going for something terrifying. I think we do need to push into the abstract a lot more than Nolan does here. I do get some mild enjoyment out of this for sure, though I certainly wouldn't call it bad. I obviously the set pieces and tension, a lot of that stuff that Nolan is usually good at is very well done here. And I really like the kind of cathartic, ambiguous nature of the ending. But I think it's just kind of fundamentally misguided in terms of how it approaches the central story. My number 9 is Batman Begins. I'm pretty sure this is the first Nolan I would have seen as a kid, and was probably one of the first movies that really made me appreciate kind of a more serious approach to a comic book film. And I definitely don't get as much out of it as I used to, but I do think there's still quite a bit to admire here. Out of all of Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, all of his Batman films, I actually think this is the one that gets the closest to what I think of as the aesthetic, the look of Gotham. It's very noir, very kind of squalid in the way it looks at the streets, and the colors pop in a way that I think is exaggerated and definitely needed in a comic book story like this. I also love the look and the performances of the central heroes and villains in the story. Of course, Christian Bale as Batman, and really Cillian Murphy as the Scarecrow as well. I think does a really great job. I think why it's a little bit lower on the list is that it's still a bit too wrapped up, I think, in being an origin story for me, or at least it's a very literal interpretation of an origin story. It spends a lot of time on the logistics of becoming Batman, the suit and the gadgets and all that, and I feel like you don't get quite as much on you don't get quite as much psychological engagement in terms of what resorting to vigilante violence actually means for the character's psyche. And while I really like Ra's al Ghul as the villain, I do think that he serves more as a device to bring the origin story full circle than he does to psychologically hold power over Bruce the way that Heath Ledger as the Joker does in the second film. Maybe it's just me, but I really like that the Matt Reeves Batman movies just kind of skipped 2 years into the story of him becoming Batman, and just kind of left that stuff to the audience's interpretation, because I feel like Batman Begins is just kind of going through the motions a bit sometimes. My number 8, maybe this is another hot take, even though I really like this movie a lot, it's a 4-star movie for me, The Dark Knight. I know it'll seem insane to some people to put this movie, and really the entire trilogy, this low on the list, but for me, I do think, especially when we're talking about this film, that it speaks more to how much I like Nolan's other stuff than it speaks to me thinking this trilogy is bad or something, because I really like The Dark Knight. I will say, from a character perspective, even though it's very well done in this film, Nolan himself has kind of called this a Heat ripoff in the way that it's showing you it's a criminal turning to a cop or a vigilante in this case, and kind of showing him how they're not so different after all. And I do think most of what this movie does you can find in Heat, but done better and more organically. And also, like the rest of the films I mentioned in the Batman trilogy, especially The Dark Knight Rises, The Dark Knight I think is too cold, it's too metallic in the way it looks at Gotham. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but yeah, it just kind of looks like Chicago or New York in this one. But with all those criticisms being said, I do think that Ledger's central performance as the Joker is really the glue that holds this entire thing together. The psychological power that he holds not only over the hero, but also over the entire city is really felt throughout the entire runtime, even after his last scene. And even though I do wish that like I mentioned, that they saved Harvey Dent, his character, for the third film, I like the way a lot that he is, used at the end of this film, how it's kind of Gotham's White Knight turned, against the city. And and the Joker is kind of exposing the corrupt city's rot in a way. So it's very good. I just think I prefer a couple of other, live action Batman adaptations, Batman Returns, Matt Reeves' version, etc. So it kind of limits its placement on the list a little bit for me, but I still think it's really good. My number 7 is Insomnia. Honestly, this used to be like top 3 Nolan for me, and while I don't think it's quite as good as I used to think it is, it's not quite as high on my list, I still think it's pretty underrated. In some ways, it's doing what The Dark Knight was doing, but in a more organic way. You have this maniacal criminal who's kind of throwing harsh hypocrisies at the detective's face. And I really think that Pacino and Williams here sell their roles really well, and I was really kind of invested in their performances. And I mentioned I tend to struggle with Nolan dialogue, especially early in his career, which Insomnia falls under. But what's interesting is that Insomnia is the only film that Nolan's done where he doesn't have a writing credit on. So for me, the script is a lot better. It's a lot less expository. I never feel like I'm being lectured to by the film. And although it's not that interesting of a project for Nolan himself, it's not doing any of the crazy time warp stuff he likes to do, I still think it's kind of underrated in that aspect. Like this detective goes to Alaska in the summer where it's always sunny. And that combined with the, this inciting incident of the film gives him so much anxiety that he can't sleep, and it just kind of distorts his perception of reality and time. I will say this film is a remake of a Norwegian film, of which I have not seen. I have heard that film has a little bit of a darker ending, which tends to be the case for foreign movies that were eventually remade into English for the US audience. So I'll have to check that out, and maybe I'll feel differently and move this down on the list a little bit, but I still really like the ending of this film. I like how kind of darkly cathartic that last scene is for Pacino's character. And so even if this is a bit of a director for hire project, I still think it's very well made, and ironically, it fixes some of Nolan's problems that I think he faced early in his career. My number 6 is Memento. So this is the only film on the list that I had to rewatch in the last few days before, while writing this script and making the video. I was pretty confident in how I felt about all of the other ones, but this one I really felt I owed another viewing. So my parents showed me this film when I was probably too young. I was probably like 10 or 12 or something like that, and I really hated it. I really found it like just needlessly confusing, and honestly, I was just way too young to understand the film at the time. But then I revisited it a couple years ago, and I kind of liked it. I was very on the fence about it because I just found the whole, backwards narrative thing gimmicky, even though it's, clearly very functional and well-structured. And definitely the dialogue I struggled with, like I do with a lot of Nolan's early films. But on third viewing, I really found an appreciation for this where I can kind of see it beyond the gimmick that it is. And I really appreciate the way it works in its genre, for its characters, for the emotion of the story overall, and kind of as well for the meta commentary kind of aspects of the film. I think Memento really highlights the way that the filmmaking process imitates memory, where you sort of have just rely on the image, the sound, the cut. And I really found the the editing of the way the way that we're viewing the film is kind of how Leonard would perceive the film as well. Because his narrative is very distorted. I actually found this this idea quite sad and much more emotional than I did the first time around. Like Leonard's memory condition is such an awful thing to live with, and that's really kind of our experience throughout the film. We're as lost as him sometimes, but really what this bizarre structure is covering up is even sadder. It's what Leonard has sort of hidden is much sadder even than his condition. And it really is the visual choices that Nolan makes behind the camera that kind of elevate this idea. And I think that despite the fact that it's a film that's very famous for the structure of its script, I think this is a total director's movie in what makes it actually work and make it be emotionally resonant. Even though I really liked it this time, I still did struggle a little bit just with, again, the expository nature that I find Nolan dialogue has early on in his career. It is a lot of, like, because of, you know, how confusing it is for the characters, you know, each scene just kind of, everybody's explaining the plot to Leonard when he comes in not knowing what's going on. Which can get very tiring. And I also think Gaspar Noé's Irreversible is a film that I think does something even more interesting with the idea of a backwards narrative, compared with Memento. But I still like it a lot, and I think that I just found a lot more to appreciate this time. My number 5 is Tenet. And if I had made this video back when Tenet came out, I think it would have been a hot take to put it this high on the list. But I think the public have really caught up since with the fact that Tenet kind of rules. I'm not going to defend Tenet on the level that it's cerebrally engaging in the way that a lot of Nolan's other really good movies are, because like Inception, I do find that this gets bogged down by the literal nature of the story, and also just, again, the dialogue is so expositional here. But unlike Inception, I do think that Tenet works much better as like a vibes movie, very much akin to something like Michael Mann's Miami Vice, for example. Although the entropy stuff in the film is really confusing, and a lot of the dialogue that would explain it is, you know, drowned out by Ludwig Göransson's score very obnoxiously, I still think it is a really great experience to just kind of go with. The film has a very, you know, solid narrative that's, you know, well within the Hollywood genre conventions. And I also, you know, it's just a really good looking, good sounding movie to just kind of lose yourself in. And the film even kind of hints at you that this is what you should be doing. You know, at one point a character says, don't try to understand it, just feel it. And to that end, I think that there is a humor in this film that I think is really refreshing for Nolan. I just like that after Dunkirk, which I'll get into, I think he really kind of restrained his tendencies in that film. I like how in this one he just went all out and is like, I'm gonna make the most Nolan film you have ever seen in your life. And the results are this weird time inversion Bond film that's done kind of in the style of Miami Vice. Like, it's just a really cool thing that it exists, and I'd be lying if I said I don't get a lot out of this. I think it's just a really awesome film experience. My number 4 is The Prestige. So apologies to a very good friend of mine who absolutely hates this movie, mainly because she prefers the film that came out, I believe, the very same year, The Illusionist, which is pretty much about the same thing. And so I haven't seen that film, and maybe if I did, I might have a different opinion about The Prestige, but just on my single viewing of the film that I had, The Prestige rocks. I think this is the film that most obviously engages with Nolan's career interest of filmmaking as illusion creation, as it, you know, kind of features this battle of wits between these two magicians. It overtly wrestles with wanting to be amazed by the trick and also wanting to deconstruct what makes the trick work. In my Letterboxd review, I called it Christopher Nolan's The Game, as in David Fincher's The Game. Both films have this really darkly comedic edge in how they examine how the artifice of filmmaking really cruelly impacts the characters in the narrative. And the entire film is just really engaging in this sort of, again, the central dynamic, this conflict between these characters. But I remember when I first watched it, I was a little put off by one particular plot device that kind of occurs in the third act, before you get to the big twist. For those who haven't seen it, I'm just gonna say it's the machine. I don't want to say too much about what the machine does. I thought it was odd that the film, you know, is trying to deconstruct the artifice of film and really pull back the curtain, but then it has this plot device that is, you know, at worst, or at its best, like kind of far-fetched science, and at worst actual magic. But really thinking about the third act and the final twist in retrospect, it does kind of make a lot of sense, because in the way that I really want to overlook the absurd kind of artificiality of the final act of David Fincher's The Game, I also want to be amazed by the final twist of The Prestige. You know, it kind of goes back to a line that the character has where it's, we want to be fooled. And that's really what cinema is, and I think that Nolan kind of gets to a very interesting conclusion of how to look at his own work. The only reason it's not higher on the list is because I've only seen it the once, but it did leave a really major impression on me, and I'm very excited to revisit it again, especially with the twist in mind. My number 3 is Interstellar. In a lot of ways, Interstellar does suffer from a lot of the problems that I've talked about that Nolan kind of faces early in his career. You know, you got expository dialogue. This also has a lot of the corny, sentimental beats that I think Nolan really struggled with in stuff like Inception. But for some reason, I've always just really loved this film despite the obvious flaws. I find that there's something so endearing about the emotion in this one, where Inception I find the sentiment to be detrimental to the overall work. This one I find that it's so corny that it becomes kind of endearing. Other people online have said it, but yeah, to me this very much feels like Nolan trying to prove the existence of love using math, like mathematically prove that this abstract concept exists physically. And there's something so earnest about like the boldness of that I just find kind of heartwarming, ironically. And so yeah, I mean, for the actual emotional beats, like I really tear up when I see them get back from the water planet, and they realize that all this time has gone by and they're kind of looking through videotapes that have been sent to them. It's really, really hard, like kind of gut-wrenching stuff. This is also just one of his most gorgeous films. I think it's the first time that he worked with Hoyte van Hoytema, and you know, like the way that he renders space using a lot of practical effects with a little bit of CGI is just really gorgeous. The wormhole sequences, you know, the black hole at the end, it looks great. It also, I think, has some of his best tension building. I'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about the top two films on the list, but I think it's something he's really great at. I love the sequence on the water planet where they realize that those aren't mountains, they're waves, and the way Hans Zimmer's score kind of emphasizes how dire the situation really is. It's just really wonderful. And I just also love the whole concept of, you know, a race against time. Earth is dying, you know, we need to find an alternative to our dying world. I think that's really great for tension building as well. The only thing that really doesn't work for me about this film is just the last like 10 to 15 minutes of the film. Basically everything after they exit the wormhole sequence, or the black hole sequence. I think you could just cut to black there. It's the one part of the film I do think is a little schmaltzy, and I think it just would have been more emotionally effective if we had cut to black again, like 10, 15 minutes earlier. But still, it does kind of play into the corniness of the film, which I do kind of think is endearing. So yeah, I like Interstellar a lot. I recognize that it has flaws, but it's always been a film I've really loved. My number 2 is Dunkirk. Dunkirk was really the first time I felt that Nolan was trying to restrain himself in order to maximize what he's really good at, which in this case is tension and sort of time experimentation. When I say restraint, I mainly mean that the script is a lot shorter and more concise, and less dialogue heavy really than has been the case for any of his other big budget projects, at least up until that point. The expository dialogue is gone from this film really, and I just find that this is his best film in terms of you know, telling the story visually through the action. The entire film is basically just one third act, which is a cool experiment in itself, and I just love how scary Nolan makes this situation, this war situation that characters are in, especially because you never actually see the Germans that are kind of the threat here. From the shot of the bombs exploding in the sand, you know, almost getting to our main character, to the torpedo sequence, it's just incredible. And I also think that sometimes for me, war films can get kind of bogged down in, you know, too much character building, sort of adding all these schmaltzy details about what characters are trying to get back home and stuff like that. And I really love how Dunkirk just doesn't do any of that. I do tend to prefer the war films like Dunkirk, Come and See, Apocalypse Now, which really just kind of focus on the immediate experience of the characters and kind of what it feels like to be in war. Even though all three films kind of have very different approaches of doing that. And of course, it's not only the tension that Nolan is excelling here, this is, you know, another time experiment for him, but I find in a much more subtle way. He's going back and forth in time, you know, to different characters as well across this vast event. And I think that the way it's done is very subtle, but very effective because the story never feels like it's slowing down. It really just kind of builds and builds and builds, yet still serving his central interests seamlessly. Some people have complained that the ending kind of wraps things up a little bit too simplistically, but for myself, I don't really look at the ending as victory so much as I look at it as the lack of utter annihilation, because that's really the threat that's looming over these characters throughout the entirety of the runtime. And the ending is comforting, but it's only because that has ceased, because there is something still very haunting about the film's tagline, survival is victory. The idea that victory is simply being alive and getting to go home, I think that there's something kind of still haunting about that, and I think the film does bring that out in the ending, even if it is a little bit subtle. And my number one, my favorite Christopher Nolan movie, is his most recent film, and that is Oppenheimer. I mentioned that I love Dunkirk because it's, Nolan restraining himself just so he can focus on, making doing a masterful job at making a very stripped down film. And Oppenheimer for me is kind of the opposite, which is to say that it's, he manages to make the kind of film I would have at one point said he should never make a film like this, but he manages to do it not only masterfully, but in his style. The idea of Christopher Nolan, who struggles with dialogue, I find, making a 3-hour biopic, much of which is just people in rooms talking, sounds like a disaster, but it was the exact opposite. The dialogue is so fast-paced, it's almost like a 40s movie, and so it can be really hard to keep up with at times, but I find that it never really, it's so focused on keeping that story moving that it never stops to kind of dumb it down for the audience. It really just kind of focuses on the immediate experiences of all of these different historical characters. And I just love what the result is. It's this really bleak, brutalist portrait of a character who, was motivated to kind of lead into this very dangerous scientific discovery. He was motivated by his own identity and sort of stopping fascism from destroying his people, but ironically his invention ended up serving the, sort of military institutions by the United States and the West itself. And I just love what a morally complicated, picture we get of this character, both from Nolan and from Cillian Murphy's amazing performance. He's obviously brilliant, but at the same time, he's really naive. He is very socially conscious, especially at the beginning of the film with some of his activities, but he's also morally askew from what the audience is wanting of him. And I mentioned Hoyt van Hoytma in, when I was talking about Interstellar, but I think this is probably his best work. It's so visually arresting. And, obviously the bomb sequence, but it also, the third act of it, I think is just amazing, and how that it kind of, the way it's shot really serves the anti-spectacle of the film. That last hour just really becomes so much more intimate and so much more character-driven. You really see, mainly just these faces on this gigantic IMAX format. Gurin's score here is also amazing. I think it's up there with Tenet for his best. It is really abrasive, and I could see that being an issue for some people, but I found the composition really sophisticated in how it's using things like that sort of feet stomping as score, and the way as well that it uses these violins in the Trinity sequence, almost like horror movie violin music. But I think my favorite thing about the film is that it does what the best historical biopics do, and that's really take a character that we think is larger than life and introduce the character that way, but then really break down that mythos and kind of make it very intimate and reduce the size of the character in the broader scope of things. I think this was advertised very pretentiously by the studios as like a biopic about the most important man to have ever lived. And I'm not going to say that Oppenheimer wasn't, but I think that the film does not, it's not trying to lecture you about how important he was. It's more about how the most important man was just a very early cog in the machine that he helped create, which became the military-industrial complex that we still live with today. And there's so many other great things about it that I haven't mentioned. We get Nolan's first real sex scene in an R-rated format. We get I find a more abstract and less literal version of his surrealism. The supporting performances are great. All that stuff is awesome. But I'll just end it by saying it's a very unexpected culmination of everything that he's really good at. And it's really the film of Nolan's that's caused me to kind of pause and think, I know I've kind of, been critical of this guy in the past, but is he maybe one of my favorite filmmakers? So in that sense, I just love it. So yeah, that's my Nolan rank. Thank you guys so much for watching. Definitely like the video down below and subscribe to the channel if you want. And also post your Nolan rank in the comments. I really am curious as to what other people think. People have very different takes on his filmography, I find. I've got more videos coming out soon. I want to get around to reviewing the new comedy Bottoms this week. Very excited for that. So I'll see you guys in the next video. See ya.